This presentation contains the life and the most important work of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. We will study about his ideologies and how he believed in absolute idealism and how he used that philosophy in his lectures, which we will be decoding. The coursework that we have to follow are the lectures on fine art delivered by Hegel in different universities, compiled into one essay. We only have to deal with the introduction of that essay, and we'll try to decode this together. So as you can see from this slide, this contains all the important information related to the life of Hegel. We don't have to delve too deep into his life and his origin and his development in academic field. We just have to know that he was an absolute idealist. We'll come to that. What does that mean? What is the meaning of absolute idealism? We'll come to that later on. So this is the only important thing about his life that you need to know. This slide contains everything that you need to know about his life. So he was born in Germany, of course, and he died there. He was a philosopher. Chiefly, he was a philosopher, but he was also an academician. But we remember him as a philosopher today. His work closely resembles Kant's work because he was his predecessor, and Hegel was heavily inspired from Kant. It is said that the modern philosophy and the modern aesthetics reached its peak in Hegel's time. So Hegel is actually the epitome of all the philosophers of his time, starting from Christian Wolff, Baumgarten, Kant, and then finally Hegel. Now, although he was a philosopher, he only dealt with philosophy, but philosophy is a very broad field, and Hegel is known to be a very varied philosopher. So he studied a lot of things. He studied logic, he studied nature, naturalism, he studied the human body, and he studied the divine, the spirit, the Geist, the absolute idea. All these things were his topics of interest, and that's why you will see that in the essay that is to follow, that we have to study, there's a lot of varied knowledge that Hegel proposes in it. So he does not stick to a one microscopic understanding of one topic. He chooses from all these different plethora of knowledge that he has gained over the years, and he uses it in everything. Another important thing to note here is that Hegel is often quoted by Marxists. So his philosophies are very much Marxist. They are not Marxist in nature, but the Marxists draw a lot of the topics related to socialism and the topics related to capitalism and the politics that the spirit of master-slave relationship in the society that he studies, and that is very useful in case of Marxism. So that's why Hegel is a very important philosopher who is studied even for Marxist philosophies. Moving on, so to understand Hegel, we have to understand certain key terms. If we decipher these key terms, we will be able to understand his essay and his essence better. So one thing I will say before starting with the essay and before starting with the philosophy associated with Hegel is that Hegel might seem very, very difficult because he talks about a lot of varied things that are not linked and connected to each other. So you might feel very you might be at a loss for thoughts when you study Hegel in deep. But then again, what is a way to deal with this is that do not always delve too deep when it comes to Hegel. Okay, try to understand that try to understand whatever he has to say on a superficial level, on a surface level, and then you will be aware of the basic thing that he's talking about. Okay, so once you grasp the basic understanding of Hegel, you will automatically, upon yourselves, you will be able to understand and decipher what he has to say. Okay, so first of all, don't delve too deep. Understand on a very surface, very superficial level. Okay, once you do that, you will automatically be able to go further from there. So as you can see in this slide, there are certain key terms that are important to understand Hegel, and these terms are rationality, dynamic opposition, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, dialectic, history, and absolute idea. Let's see what these terms are in detail. Now, when we talk about rationality, what comes to your mind? Rationality is something that is associated with logic and reason. Okay, if we say that a person is rational, that means that person has reason, that person uses his brain, and that person has logic. Okay, he will do what is logical and not be emotional. Alright, so that is rationality in our general sense. But in case of Hegel, let's understand this first and foremost, that rationality has to do more with literal sense. From where does the word rationality come? Rationality comes from the word from the word ratio. Okay, and Hegel is exactly talking about that. He's talking about rationality. Okay, so what is ratio? Ratio and proportions are, it's a chapter in mathematics where you deal with parts and places that are covered in a whole. Okay, so let's talk in a more philosophical basis. What is this? Okay, let's take an example. What makes a black object black? If I ask you this question, you will say that this is a very silly question. What makes a black object black? You will say that the blackness of it makes it black. An object is black because it has blackness in it, and that's why it's black. Okay, but what Hegel says is that the apparent, the concrete quality, the physical quality of the blackness that is present in the black object is just one part, one proportion, one ratio of the actual object. It is not everything. Okay, so the black object consists of many things together, like for example, the physical concreteness of blackness. Okay, also the conceptual association with black. When you think about black, what comes to your mind? It may be, when you see something black, negativity comes to your mind, or lack of knowledge, ignorance comes to your mind. Okay, or something bad comes to your mind. Alright, so the concept that you associate with that object comes to your mind. And the third and the most important thing that Hegel says is the dynamic opposition that this black has. What is this dynamic opposition? We will see in the next slide. So when we say that an object is black, then we are not just talking about the blackness of that object. We are talking about its quality of not being white. As silly as that sounds, that is what Hegel says, that the identity of this black object is because it is not something else. X is X because it is not Y. Okay, so black is what it is because it is not white. So everything that has an identity, it is so because of the dynamic opposition that is in play. Dynamic opposition. Pay attention to this, to these two words, dynamic, opposition. Okay, and what is the meaning of dynamic and what is the meaning of opposition? You have to put them together. Dynamic means always moving, constantly changing, and we will see that why he uses dynamic, this word here. Okay, opposition, we understand that black object is not white, so the opposition is in play, the negation of it is in play. But why does he use the word dynamic? We will see that later. Okay, so for now you need to understand that any identity of any object is not just because of the physical concreteness, the physical quality of that object, but also because of the negation that is in play, because of what it is not. If I say, if your name is, let's say, Rohit, okay, so you are Rohit not just because you are Rohit because you are not Rohan. Okay, so that is what Hegel wants us to understand. This is a very, very useful and very, very deep concept that will come into play later on when we do the essay in detail. Now, taking the same example of the black object, as you can see from the figure that the black object is not equal to white object, and this is very important. Okay, now to understand this in detail, so when he's talking about these examples, he's not just talking about material things like a black object, a black hat, or a black pillow, or a black door. No, he's also talking about concepts. Most importantly, he's talking about concepts. Okay, so one concept, like we saw in the earlier slide, a concept it has an identity because it is not some other concept. So that is the dynamic opposition. So to better understand this, what Hegel does is that he names these things. Okay, so let's say that the black object that is in question is known as thesis. Okay, so the original concept is known as thesis. The concept that is exact opposite of it, that this black object is not, is known as the antithesis. So the white becomes the antithesis. So if you take one concept, the exact negation of that concept, so that concept is called thesis and the negation is known as the antithesis. And these thesis and antithesis, they are always in dynamic opposition. Okay, they will always exist together in dynamic opposition, and their identities are not independent. They are always codependent. They are interdependent on each other. Now what will happen if this black and this white object, they fuse in together, this thesis and antithesis, they fuse in together? Of course, if they're always in dynamic opposition, at some point in time they will be reacting with each other, and they will be forming something else. So if black and white object, they combine together, what do you get? You get gray. Okay, so conceptually this is known as synthesis. When thesis and antithesis, they are in dynamic opposition to each other and they react with each other, they form the synthesis. Okay, so that is why he uses the word dynamic. What is the meaning of dynamic? Dynamic means ever changing. Okay, that means any concept and its antithesis will not always be separate entities. They will always evolve. They are always in the state of evolution, and they will be forming new concepts, new identities through time. This will always happen. So if we say that a concept, let's say the concept of feminism, you can't say that the concept of feminism is same what it was in 1800s or in early 1900s. It has changed, it has evolved, it has formed new identities, and it will keep evolving. The concept must evolve. And how does this happen? By the merging, by the fusion of thesis and antithesis, by the synthesis of these two entities. And that is why he says that the thesis and antithesis should always be in dynamic opposition. This dynamic word is very important because they have to be ever changing towards something. Now this is very interesting. What Hegel says is that the merging of the fusion of thesis and antithesis and their synthesis is not just a one-time thing. Okay, so this is like a dialogue. When you read a play, what happens? Player 1, actor 1 says one dialogue, then actor 2 says one dialogue, then actor 3 says some dialogue. Okay, the consequences and causes, they keep on happening and forming new patterns in the plot. So this is this exchange of dialogues, this discourse is known as dialectic. And what Hegel says is that the evolution or the synthesis, the process of synthesis of thesis and antithesis is a dialectic process. Okay, that means it does not just happen once, it keeps on going happening. This means that the black and white, they combine and form gray. Okay, so the black is the thesis and the white is the antithesis, and by synthesis they form gray. Now this gray becomes a new thesis. Okay, and it will again react with its dynamic opposition, something which is not gray. Okay, so then that becomes a thesis, and something that is not gray becomes an antithesis, and together they will form some other shade, some other concept. Okay, and this will keep on happening. So you can see from the figure that thesis 1 and antithesis 1 together, they form thesis 2. Now this thesis 2 plus antithesis 2 will form thesis 3, and thesis 3 plus antithesis 3 will form thesis 4. So this process of synthesis will keep on happening. It is a continuous process of synthesis, and this is always dialectic in nature. That means there is a discourse, one reaction, two reaction, then third reaction as a consequence. This will keep on happening. It will keep on happening towards something. Towards what? We will see that in the next slide. So this is basically the summary of what we have done till now. So when I ask you what is history, what will you say? History is something that is a combination of all the events that happened throughout the time, okay, till now. That is known as history. Okay, but what Hegel says is it's not as simple as that. Okay, history is not just what happened yesterday or last year or in the last century. No, it's not just that. So what he says is history is nothing but a dialectic journey. Okay, what we saw in the last slide. It's a dialectic journey of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, moving through time and forming new identities by dynamic opposition. This is called history. So every concept evolves through time. And how does it evolve? By contacting itself with the negation of its own. Okay, and then forming new identities. Then these new identities will form will form union with their negations, and then another new identity will form. And this is how a concept evolves and should evolve. Okay, but what are they evolving towards? These are the questions that you need to ask. This should come into your mind, that okay, we understand that it's evolving, but why is it evolving? Towards what is it evolving? What does the future hold for it? Does it ever stop, or it's it keeps on changing? When do we know that this concept has reached its peak? Okay, what is the end of this whole process? That are the questions that you should ask. So this is the answer to that, to those questions. Okay, so these concepts, through the dialectic process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, they are moving towards the absolute idea, the pure consciousness, and that is why Hegel is known as an absolute idealist. Now, what is this absolute idea? Okay, now to understand it very simply, okay, let's say that you have to paint, you have to make some kind of a shade. Let's say you have to make a very white shade from paint. Okay, since we are talking about colors here. Okay, so you don't have original white color with you, and you have other colors. Okay, so what you will do is that let's say you have black color with you. Okay, so you have black color with you, and then you have to turn it into white color. So what will you do is that you'll turn it into gray, then it will be light gray, then off white, then white. You'll add more white, it will become perfect white slowly. It's not a one time thing. It's not like one proportion of something is added and suddenly some a perfect shade of white is made. Okay, your friend might come and say that my shade of white is whiter than yours. Okay, so what is the standard here? All right, there's no standard. You keep on evolving. There can be a better shade than your friends also. Third person can come and say mine is even whiter. Okay, so this is the process of evolution that any concept has to undergo. So what Hegel says is that when a concept is born, when some new idea, a new thesis is born, then it has n number of possibilities to be expressed. Okay, let's say that you are a painter, you're a very famous painter, and you have to make a very famous painting. Okay, and for an exhibition. All right, and you have the idea in your head. You have to paint some village. All right, so when you're thinking about it in your mind, already it has n number of possibilities to be expressed. This tree will be here, this will be the shade, and there will be a hut there will be a river there. So in your mind, in your consciousness, the idea is absolute. Okay, it has many possibilities to be expressed. But with time, when you actually grasp the paintbrush and the canvas and you try the process, the dialectic process comes to play. The actual painting is somewhat lesser in expression. Okay, so now you have to make it better. The idea, somebody who's your disciple or some will be better than you. Okay, you will teach that person and he'll be better than you. Maybe 10 years down the lane, some other painter will be even better. Okay, so why are they bettering themselves? It's because they're moving towards the idea. And if general people think that they are not their paintings are not worth it and their predecessors were better painters, that means they're moving away from the idea. Okay, they're not reaching the absolute idea. Okay, so the purpose of every concept when it is born is to move towards the absolute idea, the idea which was born in the very first place. Okay, so as soon as the concept actually comes into being, it tends to evolve towards the absolute idea, and this is why Hegel is known as an absolute idealist. Okay, so now this is a little bit different from Kant's notion. Kant used to say that transcendental, sublime things have this unknowability about them. You can't comprehend what do they mean, but Hegel says that you can comprehend them, and the comprehension is that these ideas, these transcendental things, are they are moving, they with time they are evolving towards the absolute idea. Okay, if they reach the peak, you will know, because after that, the work will stop to, it will not be transcendental, it will not be sublime anymore. It will not produce that kind of effect. Okay, that means the idea has reached its peak. Okay, so that is the purpose of every idea. This is what you need to know, that Hegel was a firm believer in the absolute idea, the idea that exists only in the mind, in the spirit. Okay, not even the mind, the spirit. And Hegel believed a lot in the spirit. Okay, we will see why and how he believed in it. So these were the important terms that you need to understand before we delve uh, into the lectures on fine arts. Okay. Now something about this compilation I would let you know is that this is not an essay. This is not something that Hegel had written in his drawing room, in his living room, and compiled in a proper format, and then published it. No, it was not like that. Okay. So these were actually the several lectures that Hegel had given in different universities, okay, across Europe. All right, so they are not always comprehensible. They are not always coherent. Okay, they are not always same. The line of thought is not stream of consciousness, and line of thought is not same everywhere. You will find that. Okay, it's sometimes very confusing also. All right, why? Because these are lectures that have been compiled and put together by one of his students, T.M. Knox, as you can see on the cover. Okay, so he has also added, Knox has also added some of the anecdotes. In fact, some critics also say that these lectures are a little bit fiddled with. Okay, they are not actually original lectures. There are some changes that have been done. Okay, nevertheless, we have to concern ourselves only with the 90-page introduction to the volume 1 of the lectures. Okay, which is kind of an overview of Hegel's theory of fine art. Okay, if you only have to read one thing about Hegel, we are very lucky, because this is the only thing that you should read, the introduction, because it's like a proper summary of whatever Hegel has to say. And don't be put off by his reputation of being very difficult, because the introduction is pretty readable. There are some dense passages for which some familiarity with his broader philosophy is required, and this PPT is just that. It's a synopsis of the introduction, and it is presented section by section in the same order as the original, and some comment on it, so that you are better able to understand. This means that you have to read the introduction. Concern yourselves with the actual words, all right, and not just the summary. So he begins with this prefatory remark on the word itself, that the subject that we are dealing with, aesthetics. Okay, and he briefly comments on this subject, this word, and he says that the word aesthetics, taken literally, is not wholly satisfactory, since aesthetics means more precisely the science of sensation or feeling. In this sense, it had its origin as a new science, or rather as something which for the first time was to become philosophical discipline. So he kind of distances himself from the word aesthetics and says that aesthetics, for the first time, it is coming into vogue, coming into fashion to use this term aesthetics. Otherwise, what he concerns himself is philosophy. Okay, and nothing more than philosophy of fine art. Okay, so he says that the word itself is superficial, aesthetics, but he will keep using it because there is no proper replacement for the word, and it has already become a part of common speech. And the proper expression that he says for our science is philosophy of art, and more definitely philosophy of fine art. So as you can see, later on many critics have debated that what is the distinction between aesthetics and philosophy of art, because what he tends to say here is that the two things are quite different from each other, but he does not go on to explain as to why. Okay, so we there is a lot of debate. You can decide for yourself whether to call what we are studying aesthetics or philosophy of art. Now, in the second part, in the limitation and defense of aesthetics, Hegel concerns himself with what is his topic of discussion. Now, when we talk about beauty, we generally, associate beauty with the beauty of nature, the beautiful flower, the beautiful tree, the beautiful sky, the sun and the moon. Okay, but what Hegel says is that although that is, beautiful, okay, but in a very scientific way, this cannot be called beautiful. Natural things, or the beauty of natural things, is not as much as the beauty of human art form. Okay, so what does he mean by this is that the human spirit is higher in importance than the natural beauty that is available in the world. Why? Because the human spirit itself is the most beautiful thing that is there in the nature. Okay, because of course we are also part of nature, and the spirit inside us is the most beautiful thing that could ever be in nature. Okay, and that is why anything generated by this spirit, this human spirit, is more beautiful than the natural things in the world. So what he says is that even a useless notion that enters a man's head is higher than any product of nature, because in such a notion spirituality and freedom are always present. Now these two words are very important: spirituality and freedom. These are the four most important things according to Hegel in attaining the absolute idea. As I told you before, the absolute idea is something that is present in our spirit. Okay, and the absolute idea is the totality, is the total of all these expressions that could be available, the ways of expression in a totality. Okay, and they must have the spirituality, absolute spirituality and absolute freedom. Okay, so that's why he says that human spirit is more beautiful and more higher in beauty than natural objects. And of course we cannot he says that we cannot classify the beauty of nature, because that is a very useless and very vague notion. What is the standard for beauty? One can say that a flower is very beautiful. You cannot say the sun is more beautiful than the flower. How can you say? What is the criteria for this assessment? Okay, so that's why he says that we will do not deal with this confusion, and we will limit our investigation only to the beauty in art that is made by the human spirit. Now Hegel, in a very smart way, himself presents all the objections that critics and other people could raise with his arguments. He himself projects the objections that could be given to studying this philosophy of fine art, and he refutes these objections. First of all, let's see what the objections are. There are two objections that he puts forward as to the treatment of philosophy of art, and then later on we will see how he refutes these objections. So the first objection that people, according to Hegel, the people that put on philosophy of art, is that the fine art does not deserve scientific treatment. Why? Because art and beauty please us in many areas of our lives, but we may question how important they are. This is very typical. Okay, all of the people who would have asked you, and who would have ever told you that arts is something that is okay, but you can't earn money from it, and it's not useful and it's not practical. Okay, so why should we do arts? Because it's not practical. What is the use of art? Of course they'll be watching movies, and they'll be listening to songs, and they will be reading a book and everything to entertain themselves, their spirit, that is done through art form. But still they would ask how important an art form is. They'll question its validity. Okay, so now he's not refuting it, he's just presenting the argument, the objection that people say. Okay, so he says that why should we pursue such superfluous form of expression, when it is just luxury, it's just entertainment. Why should we study it? Okay, one might say that okay, there's a little bit of use of art, in that this, it gives us moral values, it teaches us the moral values on religions, and through stories and through poetry. It's a mediator between reason and sense. Okay, that means it has some sensuous qualities that moves our senses, and transforms our senses. But then, taking this argument, is it to say that according to Kant, like we saw in the last essay, that the art must have means and end it in itself? It should have the purpose and the medium in itself. But if we are saying that the objective of art form is to, have a moral reason or something, that means it has an object, it has a purpose outside of itself. Okay, so can it be called useful in that matter? The second argument, the second objection that he puts forward for himself is that art does not deserve any scientific treatment, because art has to deal with, matters of feeling and intuition and imagination and expression. Okay, it cannot we cannot deal art with scientific thinking and laws and reasons. Okay, because of course art is more free than, nature. Even nature has laws. Okay, a tree will be, you know green. If you don't put water to it, it does not get all proper treatment, it will turn yellow. Okay, but in a painting a tree can be blue also. Okay, there is complete, and it can still be called beautiful, so it does not adhere to any kind of laws as such. Okay, and Hegel says that beauty is universal, and of course it is universal, and everywhere, beautiful objects are everywhere, but it's still various and particular. Okay, you cannot say that this is beautiful or that is not beautiful just like that. Okay, universal laws are not there to tell you that, something is beautiful if it ticks off all these boxes. Okay, so therefore art cannot be brought into this under this umbrella of scientific discussion. Okay, this is what he is, he's mouthing the critics and saying that this is the argument that critics use, that this is why art cannot be thought of as a scientific matter. Now for the first objection that he puts, that, art, the purpose of art is to, present some kind of moral or be a mediator between reason and, morality. Okay, so what he says, that why make the work of art a mediator between religion and principles and, morality? Because if you're doing so, you are making matters, external. All right, so what he says, that art itself is an identical sphere, just like the spheres of religion and just like the spheres of philosophy and morality. Okay, it is parallel to them. Okay, it is parallel to them. Why? Because its purpose is also to, transcend the reader, transcend the observer to, closer towards the absolute idea, and hence closer towards the divinity. Okay, so it does not have to, give a moral value. It does not have to tell you that, cheating is bad and, stealing is bad. No, it does not need to say that out loud. By being itself, it is divine. By being itself, it is moving the people, it is transcending the people towards the absolute idea, towards the pure consciousness, and hence towards divinity. Continuing that same thought, he says that, why do we have to say that because an art form relates to appearance, that means it is not real? Why do we have to take this notion into our heads? Okay, what he says, that what scientific things show you in, concrete physical reality, even they are not real. Okay, what he says, that everything that appears in this world is not actually real. Art form is more real in the way that it is closer to the spirit, and the spirit is the absolute truth. It is the most real, the realest thing that could ever be. Okay, so that's why if the closer the art form is to the spirit, the more beautiful it is, and the more it will move the observer towards reality. Okay, so the purpose of art form is not to be concrete, it's to be closer to the spirit. Okay, it liberates the reader or the observer. Okay, again he in a very smug way says that, the current art form is not as good as it was in the ancient Greek era, and then it little bit, moved in the Greek era. It was more towards appearance. Okay, then in the Christian era it moved more towards senses. Okay, less towards senses and more towards the spirit. Okay, and today, that is in Hegel's era, he says that we need more of philosophy of art than just art forms. Okay, and today also we can say, in contemporary era, what we can say is that we need to understand and interpret art form better before we, ourselves start writing and start, producing stuff. You should know about what has been done before. And in research or work also, we see that, we first have to understand what research work has been done before, and then we know what is left to be done. Okay, and what we should do in that way. That is what Hegel is saying here, that today we don't need just art forms, we need philosophy of art. We need an understanding of what is art and how it has evolved through the centuries. We will also see that how through the ancient Greek era to the Christian era and to Hegel's era, how the association and the relationship between the content and the form of artworks have changed. This we will see in the final part of this introduction to his lectures. Moving on to the refutation of the second objection, that art cannot be dealt with in a scientific manner because it deals with imagination. Hegel says that yes, of course it deals with imagination, and the matters are produced in the heart of the artist, of course. But this form that the artist generates, in the form, in what way will he express this thought? Through a painting or through poetry? If poetry, then what kind of poetry? If painting, then what kind of painting? What shades to use, what colors to use, what material to use? This form is generated, it requires proper thought, and this thought is generated in the spirit of the artist. And how can this thought be not scientific? Because after the idea is generated, the artist has to apply his brain as to, this brush is not right, or this canvas is not right, this shade is not right. Okay, and this, if I mix these two, this will be the perfect shade that will be generated. These all require a scientific temperament, of course. Okay, and what he says, that this makes the art spiritual in nature, because the spirit generates this kind of scientific temperament. Okay, which, why the spirit generates? Because the absolute idea will be conceived in the spirit itself. Okay, and the spirit will know that what material and what medium will be most useful in attaining that absolute idea. So what he says is that because this art form is spiritual in nature, it is a matter of philosophy, and philosophy is science. Let's not forget that every science was generated from philosophy, be it mathematics, be it physics or chemistry. It was generated from philosophy. So what he says is that neither is fine art unworthy of philosophical treatment, nor is philosophical treatment incapable of descrying the essence of fine art. He's actually taunting his critics and saying that, are you saying that philosophy does not have the guts to understand art? No, it's not like that. Philosophy can understand even the most subtle of arts, and art has the perfect quality to be put under the umbrella of philosophy, which is a science. And hence art also needs, or art also should come under scientific temperament. Now, because he has established that art can be dealt with in a scientific way, he moves on to say that what are the different ways, the scientific ways in which we can treat beauty and art. And he says there are two different ways to look at art from the lens of science. And he says that first way is empirical and the second way is theoretical. Now, in the empirical way of dealing with beauty and art in the scientific way is to look at existing works of art that have evolved and that have existed throughout time till your period. Okay, so what he says that outside actual works of art, outside your time, outside your generation, outside your culture, should be dealt with. Okay, and should be read and understood and interpreted. This is actually very useful for the scholars of art, because art's diversity needs an immense range of factual and historical knowledge. Okay, if you in your own syllabus, you would have read about Aristotle, Horace and Longinus, and all these people who have drawn different formulas and different patterns to understand art, to categorize, to interpret and judge some kind of art. So what he says is that these theories, in this empirical way, we can develop principles of taste, the skills in judging artwork. But of course there is a problem with it, is it's that, once you start obsessing over these rules and these patterns, what will happen is that you'll become very dogmatic, you'll become very strict about rules and laws, and you might overlook the actual beauty. And this is the problem with this kind of scientific treatment, that you will become too analytical, you will judge very quickly. And he goes on to quote his own, to talk about his own contemporaries, the two critics Hurt and Meyer. And he says that, in Germany, this is a common trend that legalisms and the watery wastes of theories are given more importance. That means theoretical understanding of, the laws and rules of writing and all these things are given more importance, and in that, under that, a lot of beautiful pieces of work, they go unnoticed. So what he says, that the only proper kind of scholarship in this empirical way is the study of art history. Okay, when we are just studying art history, we are not dealing with whether something was good or bad. We are not judging. We are just reading the chronology of art history. So he says that only this has some value. And it has value because the study of art history is an appreciation which is made with sense and spirit. Okay, spirit, because of course you are studying art history because you appreciate the beauty of it, and that comes from within your spirit. And sense, because these are backed up with historical facts. You're not just making things of your own, you're backing it up with historical facts. That means it has both the scientific quality and the artistic quality to it. And I think, according to Hegel, what he says, that this is what the world needs. If we have to study the artworks from a scientific way, the study of art history is the only logical way to go about it. And he says that it's not just, we shouldn't just concern ourselves with the art of our own culture and our own nation, and just our times. He should look at art from other ages, like he does with the Middle Ages, the ancient Greek ages, and different cultures. He also talks about Chinese and Indian art forms later on. We'll see that. Okay, so he concerns himself with the content of the art form which is common to all mankind. Like, for example, love and passion, all these concepts are common to everybody, be it Chinese, Indian, be it American, British. No one cares. Okay, these are common concepts. So as long as the concepts are common, you should be willing to look about all these things from across the world, across the world, from different cultures, from different ages. Now, the second way to look at an art form from a scientific lens is a theoretical way. Okay, what is a theoretical way? That is the most common way that the philosophers have used till now. Okay, it is just pure reflection on the art form, looking at the art form, observing it deeply, and reflecting upon its beauty, and irrelevant to the actual content and the form of that beauty. It's just a philosophy, an abstract philosophy of the beauty about that art form. So just like Plato, this approach tries to understand the beauty itself, like the definition of beauty, what is beautiful. Okay, and of course this requires more critical and more conceptual thinking, and thinking about the idea itself, what is the most beautiful thing, and what is the standard, what is the comparison that has to be used. And because this is something so abstract, this can very quickly turn into something vague which has no concreteness to be called scientific in nature. That is the problem with it. Okay, so what he says, that this idea no longer satisfies the richer philosophical needs of the spirit today. Okay, of course we need the philosophical concepts and everything, but it does not, this preoccupation with the concept of beauty and the concept of whether something is beautiful or not, and how and what is the standard of that beauty, is something that is outdated today. Okay, so what does Hegel think? What should be done if we have to look at an art form and from scientific temperament? What should we do? So we will see that what was Hegel's own views upon this matter in the next slide. So according to Hegel, this is the most common answer that one could give. He says that we should reconcile both the extremes. So when we are looking at a work of art, some art form, we should of course look at it from an empirical point of view also, that whether it ticks off these boxes or not, whether it is sublime or not, all these laws and that these critics and greater people have been laying for you for centuries. We should take a look from that lens also. It should be empirical also, and it should also be theoretical, as in universality should be sought. Okay, whether this thing is beautiful for everybody or not, we shouldn't concern ourselves with just you. Okay, so that is also sought. So both the extremes should be mellowed down and used together. So what does this mean? This means that you look at a work of art from these point of views of laws and logic, but you should also deal with the particularity of it. That means maybe this art form is very different, maybe this art form does not tick off all the boxes that have been given, maybe it is not universally beautiful as of yet, but it is still beautiful to me. Okay, so for some work of art, for a particular work of art that you think is really actually really beautiful, the particularity should be considered. All right, so that is what he is saying, that the two extremes should be reconciled. The empirical lens and the theoretical lens should be fused together when you are viewing and judging a work of art. Now this is this is the most smug part of the whole essay. I'll tell you why. Because this part talks about the concept of beauty of art. You realize that when Hegel points out something and starts telling about something, it's not always that he's going to answer those things. Sometimes he just says things to say that he's not going to talk about it. So that is it. So he says that he talks about the concept of beauty of art, and he said when we are talking about this subject, we need to consider two things. Okay, the first thing is that whether there is such a thing called the beauty of art, and if it is, then what it is. Okay, and then he says that if we answer the first question, we will automatically answer the second question. Okay, if we say that actually if there is such a thing called beauty of art, then we will automatically understand what beauty of art is. Let me explain this. Now what he says, that if we are asking this question, that whether there is such a thing, is there such a thing called a beauty of art, if we are asking this question, then means we are checking its necessity, whether we need something called beauty of art or not. Okay, when we say that this xy, we are talking about xyz person, and we say whether prove whether this person xyz exists or not. So when we are asking for proof, we are asking for let's say about the birth certificate. What does the birth certificate say? It says who are the parents, where he was born, all these details are given. Okay, so that means to understand or to prove the validity of xyz person, we need to understand that there was some a father and a mother. Okay, there were two people who conceived this child. There has to be an antecedent for proving that a particular thing exists. There has to be a presupposition. Okay, so what Hegel says is that if to answer this question, we need a presupposition, something that led to the need of beauty of art. But if we are talking about antecedent, we are talking about a presupposition. That means we are talking about something external to the art form, and he does not want that. So he simply says that beauty is a philosophy, and to prove the validity of this artistic beauty, we'll have to prove the whole philosophy, and philosophy is such a broad thing. Okay, so he will just assume that there is something called artistic beauty, and that it is just okay, you don't need to define it. There is something called artistic beauty, and that's it. No more questions. Okay, so that is what I mean when I say that Hegel can be really smug sometimes. Now moving on to the next part, Hegel discusses the common ideas that are related to the art. What are the common conceptions that we have when we talk about art? So he talks majorly about three concepts that we have in our brains regarding arts. First, that it is a product of human activity and it's not nature. Okay, it's not a natural thing, it is a man-made thing. Second, that it is made to be apprehended by our senses. It is made to be pleasurable to our senses, and thus it is drawn from the sensuous sphere. Okay, it appeals to our senses. And third, that it has an end and aim in itself. This we have studied in Kant, that an art form will always have an end and an aim in itself. So let's see these in individually. So the first aspect that Hegel expounds is that, the art is the product of human activity. We can teach each other the rules for making and imitating art. Okay, you have drawing classes and singing classes, and why are we studying literature? Because we can teach literature and we can learn literature. Okay, but this aspect, he says that it's merely external and mechanical. Okay, and it's just, what he says is, it's an empty exercise of will and dexterity. We cannot provide such rules for the spiritual content. Okay, when we talk about gifted learners, when we say that, this person is a gifted painter, it's something that comes from the spirit of that person. Okay, we say that, he has learned it from the womb. Okay, that means that there is some inherent quality in some people, that with regards to art forms, and that cannot be taught. Okay, of course you can teach people, and there are great people who have made masterpieces by learning art forms, okay, through this mechanical exercise of will and dexterity. But there is still some aspect, an X factor, that cannot be taught. Okay, so what he says, that this part that cannot be taught is it's a spiritual content. Okay, and this spiritual content is crucial in forming the art which is more closer to the absolute idea. You might be demotivated and say that if the beauty of the art form, the greatness of the art form is dependent on this spiritual content which cannot be taught, then why are we learning anything at all? Okay, if we are not gifted, that means we shouldn't learn something at all, because we are never going to master something. So here Hegel says that, this is a wrong assumption. Okay, this is a very romantic assumption. What he says, that, the romantic writers of his era, they assumed that there has to be a gifted genius inherent in people to write poetry, okay, to make art, to paint. Okay, and he says that no, this is wrong, and he agrees with Kant when he says that, of course there is that spiritual content, but if you're not reflecting on your productivity, you're not practicing enough, you're not sharpening your skills in production, then you are not going to master that art. Okay, you see that there are many gifted people also who never become what they are supposed to, because they lack the spirit for it. Okay, they lack the appetite for it, they lack the hard work, the techniques that are required to learn and master that skill. Okay, in that regards, the person who might have a little spirit but a lot of hard work can excel. Okay, can form more beautiful art forms than this artistic genius. Okay, so here he concurs with Kant, and he disagrees with romantic writers who said that artistic genius was necessary to produce a beautiful art form. Then again he moves on to what we had discussed in the very initial slides, that, the art produced by humans is greater than the art produced by nature, the beautiful things of nature. Why? Because we are conscious people, we are consciously producing art. Nature is not conscious, it has been made that way. Okay, and of course Hegel was a spiritual person, and he was a religious person, and he says that God is more honored by what the spirit makes than by the productions and formations of nature, because that has been made by God, who is a perfect being. Okay, and of course that is beautiful, but then that cannot be there is no credit in that, because they have been made that way. But what we produce, the art that we produce it consciously through our spirit. Okay, and that's why it is any time more beautiful than natural things. Even a very small painting made by a child who has no sense of the world is more beautiful than the most beautiful flower in the world. That is what Hegel says. Now, continuing this line of thought, Hegel asks that why do human beings, of course we have established that human beings create art, it is not created by nature, and it is more beautiful than natural things, but why does the human spirit need the production of art? Okay, and this is really deep. What he says, that, there are two parts of our consciousness. Okay, one is the theoretical part, and the second one is the practical part. The theoretical part analyzes and looks at beautiful things and finds its identity in these beautiful things. Like for example, if I am a person who likes music, I will listen to these classic pieces and nice beautiful music, and I will try to represent, try to find my identity in these uh, pieces of music. I'll find ways to relate myself to it. Okay, this will be my calling. It will be as if this music is summoning me, it's calling me. Okay, and there's a second part of the consciousness that tries to, it has this impulse to change the nature of my being. Like for example, if I have listened to all the music and everything, and I know that music is my calling, then I will break this chain of listening to music and actually create music, because that is what my identity is. Okay, I produce the music myself and recognize myself in it. Okay, so these are the two ways of dealing with a work of art. One can only do it theoretically, then you never learn, you never actually do it yourself, and that is fine too. Okay, that is one part of your consciousness. You are still recognizing yourself, that you are still able to find your calling, you're still able to associate yourself with that thing. Okay, and the other part is the practical part. There are some spirits that find the impulse to actually break the chain of just finding yourself in other things and actually creating those things for ourselves. Now moving to the second aspect, that we have already discussed the first aspect, that is the artwork of art is creation of the human spirit and not the nature. Second is the common understanding about beauty of art is that art is a sensuous apprehension, that it is related only to our senses. Okay, now Hegel here begins with some observations. The first one, that he says that the purpose of art is not just to arouse feelings, to look beautiful and to appear beautiful and to cause some kind of emotions and feelings inside you, because this is just empty. Okay, and what he says is that it's not just art that does it, other things can also do it. History can also move you, history can also bring you to tears, it can touch you, it can make you feel some kind of oratory also. If somebody delivers a very powerful speech or powerful poem or something like that, can move you. Religion also, if you attend some religious ceremony, you can it will be sensuous because you will be aroused, your senses will be aroused in a way that you will be moved to tears, you will be very happy, or you can be very sad, and all these emotions you will feel. It's not just art that does that. Okay, second one, what he says that we can try to educate ourselves to understand the sense of beauty and the sense of taste, but what he says is that taste is not intrinsic to art. Taste is something that is external. Okay, when we say that a man has a good taste, that we forget to believe that that man would have his own set of experiences, and that could be favoring some kind of art form and judging some other art form in a bad light. Okay, so it can be one-sided, and it cannot it can sometimes not be very deep. Okay, it can be very superficial in nature. Okay, thirdly, he says that connoisseurship, that is understanding and studying some kind of work of art in depth, proper knowledge, having proper knowledge about that subject is also good, it's appreciated. Okay, but then in that case also you can ignore the beauty of certain beautiful objects because you are too much into the technical aspect of it. Okay, so what he says that these three things are really important, although art does have to do with sensuous apprehension, but it is not just sensuous apprehension, because these are the problems that can be generated. So what he says that it's not just sense that art should appeal to, but also the spirit, the spiritual apprehension should also be there. The spirit is meant to be affected by it and to find some satisfaction in that work of art. If not, it is not a beautiful work of art. He goes on to say that the sensuous apprehension is the least important aspect when it comes to spirit, because the spirit does not look or listen to the world. It realizes itself, and it's deeper than sense. Okay, humans do not stand in a relationship of soul and spirit just by looking any piece of art. It has to be really beautiful. It has to be a proper beautiful work of art to move your spirit, because we don't seek to use or to eat, to consume or destroy the object. Okay, we leave it free to exist and on its own account. We have done this in Kant, that the end and purpose should exist in itself. If an object has to be called beautiful, okay, you don't have you shouldn't be willing to use that work of art for some particular purpose, because then that will be related to your sense. Okay, but when we are talking about spiritual apprehension, the spiritual beauty, then the beauty exists in that object free and in itself, on its own account, without any use whatsoever. But this is to note here that Hegel does not discredit sensuous apprehension. He does not say that it's not at all required. Okay, he says that on the surface level, the sensuous apprehensions are important. Okay, the spiritual apprehension is only there on a very deeper level, because on the world basis, the superficial world basis, we are filled with shapes and sounds and sights. They exist to satisfy our senses. Okay, and only once they have caught the attention of our senses, our higher spiritual interests are satisfied. Okay, so for an artist, Hegel says that how does an artist, if you ask him that how does the artist relate to this, so he says that the spiritual and the sensuous for the artist must be in one art production. Okay, this art production he calls the active and organic unity of art, and that should be there. So with this we move on to the third aspect, the general observation related to the beauty of art, which is the aim of art. So Hegel looks at three common views with that have preoccupation with the aim of art. The first one is the art is imitation of nature. We have seen that this has been said time and again by a lot of philosophers, that art is the imitation of nature, starting from Plato. Okay, so what Hegel says is that this is the problem with this is that imitation would be superfluous labor. Okay, it would be useless, because we have nature already, so why should we imitate nature? Okay, if you want to look at beautiful trees and that is the purpose of painting beautiful trees, then you just look at beautiful trees. Why would you paint it? Okay, and even if you paint it, it would fall short of the actual nature, because in the painting it will be one-sided 2D image of the trees. It cannot match the real thing, the real trees. Okay, the 3D trees with moving branches and birds' nests and everything. It cannot match that. It will be only one-sided. Hegel also quotes the Greek painter Euxis. He was known for his realistic paintings, and realistic sculptures, and he fooled these doves into pecking his painted grapes. Okay, and what Hegel says is that this is nice, but this is just a conjuring trick. Okay, and it's a miserable achievement if you're fooling doves to peck at these grapes because what if they of course, if when they pegged it, they realized that this is bad, and it was a momentary satisfaction for this painter that okay, yes, this was he fooled the doves, but then what? Okay, then what? After that, what? Will the beauty still exist? And even if the appearance of the painted grapes were like that, was the taste like that? Okay, was the texture like that? I don't think so. Okay, so there are numerous aspects when it comes to reality of nature and then representation of it. So even if you're trying to imitate the nature, you're falling short of it. Then what is the use of it? It's a superfluous labor. Okay, useless labor. And even if, let's say that if you see painting and sculpture as imitations of nature, then what about poetry and in architecture, which are very less descriptive? Okay, in poetry you have the least medium, just words written on paper, and in architecture you have a lot of medium. Okay, that means buildings and tall towers and all these things. So they're very less descriptive. What about them? How can they imitate nature? Of course, they are also art forms, but how can you say that they imitate nature? So what he says finally is that the aim of art must therefore lie in something other than just mechanical imitation of nature. Okay, that imitation can bring in technical tricks, okay, but not works of art. Of course, technicalities can be added by observation of nature, that has to be there, but that shouldn't be the purpose of the aim of art. That is what Hegel says. The second view that Hegel expounds is that art awakens and vivifies our feelings, okay, which is true, of course, that feelings are generated when we look at a nice piece of art or something. But what Hegel says is that the human mind, the human spirit, it has a whole varied range of emotions, okay, nobility, misery, shock, pleasure, happiness, sadness, fear, anger. A lot of emotions are there, and one piece of art can hit multiple emotions. Okay, in one person it might arouse anger and misery, in one person it might arouse frustration and agony. Okay, so what is the combination that is right here? Okay, should that feeling be aroused? Was it that was intended by the artist? Okay, so this is true that it vivifies the feeling, but it's not concrete enough an aim for art, that I'll paint a painting today because I want to arouse a feeling of misery in my observers. That shouldn't be the aim of the artist, the painter. Okay, we need a more rational and more universal end, something that is common to all the artists around the world. What is that? And the last common view that Hegel expounds is that art mitigates the ferocity of our desires and improves our morality. What does that mean? That our art acts as the bridge between what we want, what is wrong, and what is right. Okay, it improves our morality. Now what he says that this is true, and this is probably a more substantial aim for art, that it's for the betterment of the society. And many philosophers and thinkers, starting from Horace in Ars Poetica, he has mentioned that the purpose of poetry is to instruct. Okay, to instruct, that means to teach, to prove some kind of morality. So what Hegel says that of course that is one important aspect of art. And he says that when we look at an art form, it can mitigate some kind of feeling. Suppose we are feeling very very sad, okay, and we listen to a really happy music, and then our sadness will be alleviated. Okay, we'll automatically become happy after listening to a happy song. Okay, so this is a higher purpose of art. Okay, but what Hegel says that isn't this external again. Like Kant, he says that if this is the purpose of art, then it's external to the work of art. What he says, that if this goodness, this morality is woven very subtly into the work of art, that the reader or the observer does not understand that this is the instruction, this is the objective of this work of art, then it is very good. Okay, but if it is an external thing, that this is the purpose of the art, so that you become a better citizen, then perhaps a person will not become a better citizen by looking at it, because this is instructed to a person. And psychology says that if you're instructed something, negative psychology kicks in, and if you will do something that is not instructed, you'll do the opposite of what is instructed. Okay, so the purpose is anyway defeated. Okay, and if we are talking about morality, that the purpose of art is morality, Hegel says, what is morality? Morality is not something which is very straightforward. It's not just black and white. Morality is something which is a gray quality. Who draws the morality? Who says that this is wrong and this is right? For some person it will be wrong, for the other person it might be right. Who decides that? So that's why he says that this is also not a very concrete idea for the aim of art, that the aim is for morality. Okay, we shouldn't aim for that. We can weave it into our art form very subtly, but shouldn't be our only objective. Now this is what Hegel says from his own. Till now he was explaining what are the common views on the subject of art. Okay, now his own view is that we stand at this opposition. Like, remember when we talked about thesis and antithesis. So this is what he says here. This is what is important here. That he says that any kind of art form, when we are judging that art form, we stand in two contradictory worlds. One where we have to deal with the universality of that object, that whether this is beautiful in my eyes, but it is whether it is beautiful in everywhere across the world, across the universe. Okay, and the particularity of that object, that okay, maybe it's not beautiful for other people, but it's beautiful for me. Okay, so we stand at this point of dilemma, that whether this is beautiful or not, whether this is universally beautiful or whether this is particularly beautiful. Okay, and it is okay to have these two contradictory world. And the work of philosophy of art, and that's why he says that he does not want to use aesthetics particularly, but the philosophy of fine art. The work of philosophy of fine art is to let the people know that it is okay to stand in this contradiction, because you are forming a new opinion, you're synthesizing the thesis and antithesis to form a new thesis, something that is your own understanding of art. And it is okay, that is the most truest form of art, because you are believing your spirit. And when you're doing so, you should listen to your spirit. You shouldn't be swayed by the purpose that is external to art, that whether it is good or not, whether it is good for the society or not. Something should, that voice should come from within your spirit. That is the work of philosophy of art, to make you understand that the contradiction is good, because you're forming a new thesis. And this is how the concept of beauty will evolve through the dialectic process in the history. So in the end, he says that we must maintain that art's vocation is to, and it's important, to unveil the truth in the form of sensuous artistic configuration, to set forth the reconciled opposition, the opposition between the spiritual and the sensuous, the superficial sensuous pleasure derived from that object, and to have an end and aim itself in this very setting forth and unveiling. For other ends like instruction, purification, bettering, financial gain, struggling, fame, honor, these things have nothing to do with the work of art as such and do not determine its nature. Okay, so the two things that are important and are at contradiction are the sensuous and the spiritual understanding of that work of art, the universal and the particular understanding of that work of art. And you have to stand in between and decide for yourself without being swayed by other things, like all these things that he has mentioned, financial gains and fame and honor and other things. So this is his final word. Moving on to the next part, he talks about, because we have now already discussed about dialectic and how a concept evolves through a dialectic process and then the history is formed. So here he talks about the historical deduction of the true concept of art. Okay, now he particularly talks about this romantic irony. He does not explain in his lecture what this romantic irony is, but Knox, the student who had compiled all his lectures, and he has added a footnote to explain romantic irony. And he says that romantic irony is a term that is derived from Schlegel, and it's generally meant to understand, to tell you that when an artist compiles a work of art, when an artist makes or produces a work of art, he does it creatively and through emotions, of course, but while he's creating that, he should remain self-critical. Okay, that whether it is good or not, whether I should add something, reduce something, that should always be there. Okay, now Hegel says that this concept of romantic irony, although it is very much in fashion, but it is somewhat problematic, because this kind of disturbs the natural phenomena that happens inside the artist's brain that reaches the absolute. Okay, it messes up with that relationship between the spirit and the absolute idea. Okay, because if you are too critical of yourself, you might not believe the raw opinion that is there inside your spirit. You will not hear it. Okay, and he again in his very unique smug way, he says that if this is the thing, if this is the pattern to be followed, if romantic irony is to be followed, then all these people who have sided with romantic irony, like Solger and Tieck, all these people, even their criticism can also be self-critical, and they will also have to understand that what they're saying is not right. Okay, anybody who produces anything, whether it is factually correct or wrong, whatever, they will be self-critical and there will be no original opinion whatsoever. So that's why he says that this romantic irony thing is not something to be fond of, that he's not particularly fond of. he also, in the same line of thought, he also gives kind of a brief overview of all the contemporaries and the predecessors before him, who have talked about concept of beauty of art, like Kant, Schiller, Schelling, Winkelmann, Schlegel. All these people he has talked about, and he has given a little bit, of his own overview about it. You can read in the slide what he talks about. He generally confers with Kant, okay, and he says that he is the one who is the master of the philosophy of modern times, okay, and then he talks about other thinkers and philosophers. Now, coming to the last part of the introduction, the last part is the division of the subject. He says that how can we divide this concept of beauty of art? Uh, what is the proper way of classification of this beauty? Okay, and remember we have talked about the definition of history for Hegel is the dialectic process of, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis through time, until it reaches the absolute idea. And what is the absolute idea? That the totality of all the forms of expressions that it can have, a total of all the kinds of expressions that a concept can have. Okay, so this expression is the combination of the content and form. Okay, content is the idea, okay, that is in your spirit. Okay, form is the way of expression, and there can be numerous ways of configuration of this content and art form, and it is based on this that the classification of the art should be done. Like I gave you an example of how to attain the perfect shade of white, you have to go through a process of, black, then gray, then, off white and cream, and then white, and then perfect white. This is the stage that you have to go through, and while going through this stage, you have to mix a lot of different shades and everything. So like, you have to use one thesis and one antithesis and synthesize them to form a new thesis, which will have its own antithesis, and the process will go on. So he says that the idea of beauty of art, and to reach that absolute idea also, there has to be a course of stages which that idea has to go through. Okay, the first one is the idea of the beauty of art, or the ideal, and he says that, the truth, or the original, the raw beauty of that art should not be confused with technical correctness. Of course, there will be defects. No art form can be perfect. Okay, there will be some kind of defect, and that defect can flow, through the dialectic process, and the correctness will be, the art form will keep evolving itself until it reaches its peak. So that should not be confused with beauty. Okay, that if a particular piece is a little bit defective, it cannot be beautiful. No, that is not the case. It can be beautiful, because the beauty or the art is, it's in a dynamic opposition with what it was. Okay, right this very minute, the art form is not what it was 1 minute ago. It keeps on evolving. It keeps on, bettering its defects through time. Second is the development of the ideal into the particular forms of beauty of art. Like I told you, that the configuration between the form and the content is what we have to study, is what we have to classify. Okay, and just like what we have seen in the dialectic process, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, works of art also go on in this dialectic manner. There will be one work of art, then there will be it will reconcile with some other work of art, and they'll form a new work of art, and then it will reconcile with other work of art, and then therein a new work of art will be created. So all this work 1, work 2, work 3, work 4 together, they form the art history, and that is how one particular art form will evolve conceptually. Now, this is probably the most important part of the introduction, and Hegel says that there are 3 stages for the development of fine art. Later on, initially he says that these are the stages of development of fine art, and later on he calls these the universal moments of idea of beauty. Okay, and there are 3 universal moments of ideas of beauty, which are symbolic, classical, and romantic. Do not confuse them with purely the ages, the classical era, the romantic era. No, we are talking about the concepts related to these era. Okay. Now, what is different between each stages is the relationship, the configuration of the relationship between the idea, which is the content, and the form, the configuration. First of all, in your head, clear the concept of the idea and the configuration, content and form. Content is something that originates in your spirit. Like, for example, I am feeling very homesick, I want to write a poem about my home. That is the idea. Okay, now whether I'll write it in a sonnet form, or I'll write it in a ballad form, or I'll write it in an elegy form. Okay, I'll write a short poem, I'll write a very long poem, I'll write an epic, an elegy, whatever. Okay, so that is the form. So the relationship between the content and the form is what forms these particular stages: symbolic, classical, and romantic. Let's see what each stage is. Now the first one here is the symbolic art. Okay, this is the most raw, the most initial form of the art, and he says that the art begins fermenting. Okay, the shape that it will take on later is, it's formed here. Okay, you have to see it from a very historical point of view. Okay, so he talks about the ancient Eastern art forms, prehistoric art forms. If you see, the prehistoric art forms were these stone sculptures which were very vague. Even they were not very clear about it. It was not very defined artistically. Okay, but they had forms. Like, if they worship the sun god, they will draw sun and worship it. If they worship the nature, they'll draw rivers and they'll draw trees and they'll worship them. Okay, so they related these concepts that they had in their mind into direct concrete forms. Okay, and they were so physical in nature that they were not very clear as to what they wanted to say about it. Like, of course, okay, it was clear that they're talking about the wind, they're talking about the river, but what are their concepts associated with it, which it was not very clear. Okay, so that is what is known as a symbolic art. Only symbols are present. You have to deduce for yourself what do they mean. Okay, so the symbolic art form of Indus Valley civilization, Harappan civilization, if you see, they are symbolic arts. Okay, they are manifested in concrete forms which are not very clear, which are not very understandable. Next, he talks about the classical art, which is a little bit better form than the symbolic art. So he says, when we are thinking about these concepts, imagine the classical era, the art of the classical era. If you see, in the classical era, every art form revolved around sculptures and the human body. Okay, so what happened now is that human body was given more importance. Each and every curve and crevice was expressed properly in the sculpture. Okay, the original concept, what Hegel says, is God, of course. Okay, and God created the human spirit, which is the artistic spirit, and that's why it has to be the center of the art. Okay, which is really good. Okay, but what is the problem with this classical art, is that the spirit is not represented. Of course, the body is represented, but spirit is not represented in this art form. So that is what was lacking in this art form. In the symbolic art, we see the physicality, the concreteness was so much that it was not clear enough for us to understand what it meant. In the classical art, we see that the concrete reality was very clear. The central idea was human body, but the human spirit was not represented in the true form. Now, all the shortcomings of the symbolic in the classical art forms are corrected in the romantic art. Okay, so Hegel says that the romantic art form goes beyond the classical art, because in classical art, the connection between the divine and the human was shown through. It was shown through sculptures in a very sensuous way. It dealt with senses. Okay, but the spirit was missing. Okay, and he says that a higher way of representing the spirit is when it does not have to be expressed by some concrete physicality. It is known. Okay, it is not the spirit does not have to be found. Okay, in the symbolic form also, you saw that it has to be found. Okay, you have to understand what was this connection. Okay, in classical form, this connection was established somewhat, but still there was some way of, you know, realizing this the spirituality in a better way. Okay, so these shortcomings are overcome in the romantic art. So ultimately he says that this is the final and the most important art form, and he says that in romantic art the idea is perfected, the absolute idea that is born in our spirit is perfected in spirit and heart. It's a higher perfection. Okay, so everything that art has strived from the symbolic art to classical art is manifested in the romantic art. Now, if you remember, Aristotle talks about these fine arts, and he divides these fine arts into different categories. He says that, you know, poetry is the finest of the fine art, and then comes painting, and then comes sculptures and architectures. Okay, so it's somewhat related to that. So what he says that, you know, these are the different stages, and the eras that are associated with these stages have a particular form of art. Like, for example, in the symbolic art form, the relationship between the art form and the absolute idea is striving. They're striving to make a connection. The connection is not happening. Okay, and the form of art that was used for this was architecture. Okay, so in you know, Harappan civilization and Indus Valley civilization, what are the art forms that we find beautiful? They are, you know, the great bath, the sewage system, the civilization, the perfect forms of architecture. Okay, in the classical stage, the relationship between the art and the absolute idea is attaining. It's towards that, almost reaching that absolute idea. Okay, and the form of art that was used for this was sculpture. Human bodies can be represented best by sculptures. Okay, and the last stage of art is the romantic art form, where the relationship to the idea is transcending. The art is going even beyond the absolute idea. Okay, it's transcending, it's moving the readers towards a spiritual realm. Okay, and the form of art that is associated with it is painting, poetry, and music. So you see the difference. Painting, poetry, and music is something that doesn't, they do not need too much of physical concreteness. Painting and music and poetry, they can be done on paper. Okay, they don't need a huge, you know, variety of mediums and concrete, like, you know, stones and marble and chisel and hammer, all these things. They can, you can just write a few words and move a person beyond sublime. Okay, so these are the different stages of art. First symbolical, second classical, and final art form is romantic art form. So finally, Hegel concludes very grandly and says that, you know, this whole dialectic of art history, we don't, it occurs in the fact that we don't have to think about it, that, you know, we are contributing to art history, or, you know, like that. We are just observing art forms, creating art forms which are associated with our spirit, closer to the to the absolute idea. And while we are doing so, while we are realizing this absolute idea, while we are appreciating beauty of these objects purely through our spirit and everything, this whole art form is conceptually evolving without us even knowing. That is the beauty of the philosophy of fine art. That is what we are studying, that we, even without realizing, art and concepts related to art are evolving every minute. Okay, and this is just the introduction of Hegel's fine, you know, lectures on fine art. He delves in much deeper later on. If you are interested in it, do read him. And the introduction is really a great way to start reading about Hegel. I did, you know, I started reading Hegel by reading this introduction, and it's a never-ending process, because he is really interesting. He has some really interesting things to offer, things to explain, and things that are associated with sociology, with politics, and they are so apt in today's world, so real even today, that, you know, and that's why therein lies the greatness of thinkers and philosophers like Hegel. So do read him ahead if you are interested in his philosophy. And that is all. in this presentation. Everything has been covered. What has not been covered in words has been written in the slides, and you can refer to it to understand it better. If you have any doubts or any comments about it, you can always contact me, and I'll be happy to follow. Thank you.